So, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to a very special class as we are just a few days before Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av this year falls out on Sunday, starts Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos. And as we know that Tisha B'Av, the ninth of Av, commemorates the destruction of both holy temples, the Beit HaMikdash Harishon, the first Beit HaMikdash that was built by Shlomo HaMelech, and the second Beit HaMikdash, which was later built when the Jews came back from Babylonia with Ezra, Darius, and Cyrus, and then King Herod Hordus expanded it, and it was also destroyed on Tisha B'Av. The law of Tisha B'Av is to fast and to refrain from doing anything of pleasure. We don't bathe, we don't swim, we don't take haircuts, and we sit on low stools. But one of the focal points of Tisha B'Av is reading the Book of Lamentations, which is the book of Eicha. And Eicha means, how was it? Yoshva Bodot. So the mimer that we're going to learn tonight is a mimer that the Rebbe delivered in 1971, and that day it was Tisha B'Av that fell out on a Shabbat. So therefore all the observances of Tisha B'Av were pushed off till Saturday night. But Shabbos was Tisha B'Av. And we weren't expecting a Farbrengen. Actually, I was a student in Morristown at the time, in Morristown, New Jersey, and I called my father, Olav Hashalom, Friday early afternoon to wish him good Shabbos, and he asked me, so what are the arrangements for Shabbos? I said, we're staying in the yeshiva, and we're going to have Tisha B'Av in the yeshiva. So he says, oh, I thought you're coming to New York. So I said, do you think it's a good idea for me to come to New York? He said, it's a very good idea for you to come to New York. So when I hung up the phone, I ran to the head of the program from the yeshiva, and I told him what my father said. He spoke subsequently to my father as well. And my father also told him it would be a very good thing if you would all come to New York. So we all came to New York for Shabbos, and sure enough, that Shabbos the Rebbe Fabreng. So we were very grateful to my father that the Rebbe had the gathering, but the gathering was very different than all the others because the Rebbe started immediately with this Hasidic discourse. As soon as he sat down by the Farbrengen, when the shul was not so packed, but it was very full. And he said that they should sing the song, and then he began the mimer. And the mimer was a lengthy mimer, and you saw that the whole gathering was specifically for this mimer. And then this mimer was immediately edited by the Rebbe after Shabbos and printed so that all the Chabad centers around the world were able to study it the Shabbos after that. It's a very fundamental mimer. It's a powerful mimer. We won't get through all of it in one session, but at least we'll try to give a little bit of a taste of it. So I'm going to read it aloud in English, so it'll be better understood, and hopefully the point will come across. So the beginning of the mimer starts with the words Eicha Yoshva Bodod Ha'ir Rabasiyam. Eicha means, how is it that the city, and it's referring here to the city of Jerusalem, sits in solitary. What does it mean that it sits in solitary? We have to remember that Jerusalem was the center of the world at that time. It was at the crossroads between Asia and Africa. It had the kingdom of Israel. It had the kingdom of Judah. There was a lot of activity there, and it was a place that people would come for commerce. People would come to travel there. It was a very attractive city, Jerusalem of gold. And here, after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians and the terrible slaughter of the Jews of Jerusalem, and the rest that survived were exiled, so the city sat in solitary. So Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, the prophet, cries out, how does the city sit in solitary? Isolation. She was filled with a multitude of people. So before that, it was the hub and it was the center of life in a fascinating way, in a glorious way, in a very uplifting way, with the temple standing on the Temple Mount as the center attraction. And now it is totally destroyed. And that is the lead-in to the whole reading of the scroll of Eicha, which talks about the horrors of the destruction and the subsequent horrors of the exile. So the Rebbe says that the Tzemach Tzedek was the third Chabad Rebbe, and the Rebbe in parentheses says his name is Tzemach. And the reason why he says his name is Tzemach, that's a quotation from the Haftorah that when it speaks about Mashiach, it says that the name of Mashiach is Tzemach. And the Rebbe is indicating here that the Tzemach Tzedek, his name was Menachem Mendel, and by the way, in the footnote of the Maimer, the Rebbe writes that the gematria of Tzemach Tzedek is the same gematria as Menachem Mendel. And that his idea, what's the idea of Mashiach, is seeing everything in a positive light and bringing positive energy to the world. So that Tzemach Tzedek interprets this verse with a positive connotation. And what does he say? He explains that Jerusalem sitting solitary reflects an elevated spiritual state. As it's written, and God let him alone. That God leads the Jewish people alone, that they are alone and above everyone else. And it is also written, securely and alone, betach badad ein Yaakov. Securely and alone, as in Yaakov's blessings. What does this mean? So when we talk about the word badad, by the way, badad today is a very well-used word, just a little bit of different. We say bidud. In Israel, when COVID hit and they forced people to go into isolation, it was called bebidud. So when people come to Israel, they have to go into bidud and they have to get tested to see if they have the virus or not. And if they test negative, so then they can go out of bidud. So the word bidud comes from the word badad, which means all alone. The idea of being in isolation, the question is isolation a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer is it depends on what context you put it in. If you're in a negative environment, if you're in an environment where it has a negative connotation, that you are popular and all of a sudden you are forlorn, you are isolated, you are segregated, you are discriminated against, so then it has a negative connotation. But then it can also be a positive connotation for the person that pulls ahead and rises to the top. For instance, if you're watching a race where people are running around the track and they all start together, and then all of a sudden one of the athletes pulls ahead and runs and runs and runs and is way ahead of the competition. So that segregation of being way ahead of the competition is not a negative, it's a positive. It's on top of the heap, so to speak. So the Tzemach Tzedek here takes the positive attitude, and he says that this exalted state will come about as a result of being filled with people, as will be explained. So he turns around this verse and he doesn't see it in a negative, he sees it in a positive. He says, how will this city sit solitary? It will be on top of the world because there will be a multitude of people in Jerusalem, and yet the people of Israel will be way above the rest. So the Rebbe asks a question and he says, this interpretation is difficult to understand. Why is it difficult to understand? Because the word eicha, which means how is it, is an expression of wonderment. So according to the explanation, that sitting solitary alludes to the fact that the Jews will ascend to the level indicated by the verse, God led them alone. In other words, a positive connotation of being alone outside the camp, a rung above the spiritual cosmos. It's necessary to understand why does this statement bring about wonderment. Aloneness of this type is a natural expression of the Jews' inherent spiritual nature. We find it mentioned numerous times in the Torah that the Torah refers to the Jewish people as the chosen people. They were chosen from amongst all the nations to be a priestly nation, to be closest to Hashem, to have the privilege of doing Torah mitzvahs and sanctifying themselves to such a high level. So why are we bewildered when we say that Jerusalem sat on top above everybody else? So that's one question. How does it fall into the context of Eicha? A second question is, how does this fit in with the simple interpretation? We know as a fact that it says many times in the words of the sages that as many midrashic interpretations that you might have to a pasuk, they still say, Ein mikra yoytzei midei pshutei. You can't take a pasuk out of its straightforward meaning. The straightforward meaning always remains with it. You can add onto it one layer to another layer. But when you add on something which is contradictory to the straightforward meaning, then it's not a proper interpretation, because you can't strip it away from the straightforward meaning. So this is where the next question comes from the Rebbe. So the Rebbe asks, this interpretation is difficult to understand. The word eicha, it is also necessary to understand how can this interpretation be reconciled with the simple meaning of the verse, which reflects the awesome descent experienced by the Jewish people. Furthermore, for this reason, that it describes the awesome descent of the Jewish people, Eicha is read on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the anniversary of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. What then is the connection between the simple meaning of the verse and the interpretation of the Tzemach Tzedek, which is understood in a positive? So this is the straightforward question on the Tzemach Tzedek. Obviously, the purpose of the question is not to refute it, but rather to dig deeper and find an insight which we didn't think about. So here we're going to come to another explanation, another concept, and that is the concept of the Beit HaMikdash itself. So the Rebbe continues and he says, these questions can be resolved by explaining the unique positive quality of the Tzemach Tzedek's interpretation sitting solitary and its association with the verse securely alone as in Yaakov's blessings. What does it mean securely alone as in Yaakov's blessings? What does it have to do with Yaakov's blessings? Why does it say Yaakov? So the Rebbe says the reference to Yaakov's blessing is precise. In other words, it's intentional to talk about Yaakov. Why about Yaakov? So first let me say, who's this Yaakov that we're talking about? We're talking about the patriarch Jacob. So as you know, there were three patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The difference between the three wasn't in their holiness. Each one was very holy. Avraham was in a passionate, kind way. Yitzchak was in a strong way, in a strict way. Yaakov was more in a compassionate way. But the big difference is in their descendants. Abraham had two children. 50% of his kids turned out to be great. That was Yitzchak. 50% of his kids weren't so great. That was Ishmael. Similarly, Yitzchak had two children. Again, 50% of his children turned out to be great, and 50% aren't so great. And in fact, the two nations or the two civilizations that the children of Jacob had the worst experience with in the long history of our exile is with the descendants of Yitzchak by Rome and all of the descendants and the connection to Rome, and then also by the Ishmaelites. But what does it say about Yaakov? It says about Yaakov, mitaso shlema, that his seed were complete. All of his 13 children, his 12 sons, and his daughter remained loyal to God. As the Rambam says, that before Yaakov passed away, he was worried where they are spiritually, and they said the verse, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Shema Yisrael, hear our Father Israel, our God, our Lord is the same God. We're all loyal. We're all part of it. So for that reason, the concept of eternity and continuity is reflected in Yaakov. So therefore, if you see continuity reflected in Yaakov, it also has to do with the Beit HaMikdash. So he says that our sages, and it's actually in the Talmud, associate the third Beit HaMikdash with Yaakov, stating this site will not be called a mountain, as referred by Avraham. By Avraham, he did it on the mountain. What was the mountain? He went on the mountain to bring his son as an Akedah, not a field referred to as Yitzchak. What was the field by Yitzchak when he went out to daven mincha, when his wife came to him with Eliezer? But rather a house referred to by Yaakov. The house is Beis Yaakov, the house of Jacob. So what does it say? The uniqueness of the dwelling securely alone, as in Yaakov's blessing, that will be realized in the era of redemption, the time of the coming of Mashiach, and in particular in the third Beis HaMikdash, which is identified with Yaakov's description of the Beis HaMikdash as a house. So when the sages say that the third temple will not be like a mountain or a field, what they mean to say is you can have a house on a mountain, but then the mountain, then the mountain stays alone. In other words, the house is demolished and it remains a mountain. You can have a house in a field, or a tornado comes and the house is no longer there. But the house of Yaakov was always a house that it was a permanent house. It was always there, which means to say that the third Beit HaMikdash will be the eternal Beit HaMikdash, unlike the Beit HaMikdash in the time of Avram, which represents Avram, that there wasn't eternity to it, but the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Similarly, the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, but the third Beit HaMikdash that will be built by Mashiach, that will be an eternal edifice. And that's where he says, this also refers to our sage's description of the heritage of Yaakov as an inheritance without any boundaries, the ultimate of desire. So what is he saying here? That it's an inheritance without boundaries. It means that it has no boundaries, not only no boundaries of space, but it has no boundaries of time. It will be eternal. It will be limitless, which that's what it says about the third Beis HaMikdash. So what we're learning here is that there were two Batei Mikdash that were already built, even though they were very holy and they had the full glory and the revelation of God, but it wasn't permanent. It's only the Beit HaMikdash that will come from Yaakov. And then he says that Yaakov is actually compared to Shabbat because it's the ultimate of desire, or it's the ultimate of delight. As our sages say, whoever delights in the Shabbat will be granted the inheritance without any boundaries, the heritage of Yaakov. So because Shabbat is also connected to the time of Mashiach, as it says that Mashiach comes, every day will be like Shabbat, so there will be the great revelation of godliness, but not only that, it'll be a revelation that will be unlimited. So he says, this sublime level, which will be realized in the era of redemption, will come about as a result of sitting solitary in the time of exile. So what is he saying here? He's saying over here, how will we come to that point? Because, there's a statement that nothing is for sure. There's no certainty. The joke in America is that there are only two things that are certain, and that's death and taxes. But the truth of the matter is that nothing is certain except God. And here God says through the prophets that the third Beit HaMikdash and the era of the redemption that will come with Mashiach will be eternal. And it'll be forever. And it'll all be like a Shabbos. But he says, how will that come about? It'll come about as a result of the isolation of the Jews, that the Jews will be in solitary, that the Jews will be segregated. So what's this segregation that we're talking about? And this is something that we have to understand, which the Rebbe will explain in the next few paragraphs. He says, in this context, we find that our sages compare the exile of the Jewish people to Adam's sentence to exile after the sin of the tree of knowledge. So let me explain something over here a little bit, and that is the following. The Rebbe builds it on a concept that it says in the Talmud and in the Midrash, that every descent is for the purpose of ascent. In what context is it said? It's said in the context of a neshama, the soul which is on high in the Garden of Eden before it's born, and it is in the realm of godliness, and it relishes the divine light, and then the soul is tapped and told that you have to leave this comfortable environment where you are nurtured spiritually, godly, divinely, and you're living the spiritual life at the highest level, and you need to descend into a lowly world, into a physical body, and be trapped in this body with all the physical desires and all the physical pleasures. And the neshama, when it descends, cries. And the words are, "Neshama yoredet," lamata, when the neshama descends below, tzoeket, vai, vai, vai. It's screaming, vai, vai, vai. That it's in such pain that it's taken out of its comfortable level and it's thrown and thrust into something which is lower than a cellar. And that is in our world. And it says, Yerida Zut Tzarech Aliyah, that this descent is for the purpose of ascent. That every descent that happens is not for the purpose of descent itself. It's not punitive, but actually it's a way to refine the soul to reach to a higher level. So over here, what the Rebbe introduces is that although we view the exile and the diaspora as a punishment for the sins, and as we say in the davening of Musaf, that because of our sins, we were exiled from our land, but nevertheless, the punishment doesn't fit the sin. It doesn't fit the crime. What do I mean by that? Because even the lowest level of life that the people in Israel reached, it doesn't deserve such a lengthy and brutal exile that the Jews experienced for the last 2,000 years. So for that reason, we have to come to the conclusion that it's not at all about punishment. Could be a part of it is about punishment, or the beginning was about punishment, but really it's there for a sense of refinement. We find the same thing that when the Jews were exiled in Egypt and they went out, so it says when they went out from the refinery, that there was a refinery. That what does a refinery do? When you put gold in a refinery, it extracts the gold in a pure way and it gets rid of the waste, it gets rid of the impurity. So the refinery allows the beauty of the soul to shine. So the way we will actually merit the greatest reward of ever, which is an unimaginable reward, which that is eternal bliss, with the coming of Mashiach and the building of the third temple, which will be everlasting, is because of this solitary. Solitary over here means an exile. That Jews were discriminated against, Jews were thrown into exile, Jews were distant, and this is all a prelude to the greatest gift of all. And he gives several examples. So the first example that he says is, in this context, we find that our sages compare, the exile of the Jewish people to Adam's being sentenced to exile after the sin of the tree of knowledge. So over there again, he sinned against God by eating from the wrong fruit, but to be punished in such a way that he was thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And he was told that now with the sweat of your brow you will eat bread, and all other kinds of challenges and difficulties. It doesn't match it. So for that reason, we know that the descent of Adam was that through that, the people will come to a much greater ascent. And what was that, as he will explain soon, the revelation at Sinai. So he says the comparison can be extended just as Adam was God's handiwork. In other words, he was created by God out of clay, and God breathed into the Adam, into his nostrils, a soul from the essence of God. So too the Jewish people who were sentenced to exile, as it says in the Mishnah, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands. Before we recite the Pirkei Avot, we say, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek le'elam babosh, shenemar le'elam yisharetz netza matoi ma'aseh yad le'ispar. Netza matoi means that the branch of my planting, the work of my hands. And as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that it means that it's an actual part of God above. So that's where you have the similarity between Adam and the Jewish people. So Adam was sentenced to exile for the sake of the ascent, which will come as a result. This was reflected in the spiritual heights reached at the giving of the Torah, at which time mankind reached a higher level than experienced by Adam when God placed him in the Garden of Eden to work and protect it, as will be explained. Before the giving of the Torah, there were 7 generations who angered God and caused the divine presence to withdraw and ascend upwards. And then there were 7 generations afterwards that drew the divine presence downward, making possible the giving of the Torah. Which means to say that the descent that was started by Adam when he sinned with the forbidden tree, the fruit from the forbidden fruit, and he descended to the lowest level, subsequently another 6 generations ascended after him. Then there was the great ascent until the final ascent in the time of Moshe, which drew down the essence of God at Mount Sinai with the giving of the Torah. And then the Rebbe says, similarly in subsequent eras, there were successive sequences of ascents and descents. In other words, it always works that way. You go down and you go up. And that's why in Judaism we say whatever goes down ultimately needs to go up. So after the giving of the Torah, the Jews were intended to enter Eretz Yisrael and build the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash is described as the place which God chose and reflects a higher spiritual level than the sanctuary in which it's said I sojourned in a tent. So in other words, even though the Mishkan was a place where God dwelled, but it's called a temporary residence because it's only a tent, the Beit HaMikdash was much more permanent, and there was a higher level of holiness that was there. Not only that, the tent, even though it drew down the holiness of God, it wasn't permanent. Because when they dismantled the tent and packed it up and went to another location, the place where the tent stood before was returned to an ordinary space. It wasn't considered holy. But the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, as Rabbi Acha says in the Gemara, that the western wall, which is the only remnant of the Beit HaMikdash, Kedusha has never moved away from it, because the Kedusha there was permanent. So they were supposed to go straight from the desert into Eretz Yisrael, into the land of Israel, and to build the Beit HaMikdash. But this ascent did not come directly. Instead, there were several disruptions before the building of the Beit HaMikdash. As we know, they sinned with the spies, and then they were delayed 40 years. Then they came, and they still couldn't build. There was ups and downs, peaks and valleys, as they say. But each valley led to a higher peak. And the spiritual peaks attained at the construction of the Beit HaMikdash was followed by a descent, the destruction, which was the destruction by the Babylonians, one of the reasons why we lament on Tisha B'Av. This in turn was followed by an ascent, the building of the second Beit HaMikdash, which in certain dimensions surpassed the first Beit HaMikdash. For as our sages interpret the verse, the glory of the latter house will be greater than that of the first, is referring to the second Beit HaMikdash, which surpassed the first Beit HaMikdash in size and in the number of years which it stood. And even though the ark wasn't in the Holy Temple, but the Rebbe explains in the Sikha, and I had shared that video from Rabbi Alperovich in Bournemouth talking about it, that when Solomon built the temple, he initially also built a place for the temple below place for the ark below the temple. So there were two chambers that were designated for the ark. And before the destruction of the first temple, he took the ark and he hid it in that location, and it's there until today. Which means to say that in essence, even when the second temple was built, it wasn't lacking that holiness. So therefore, we say that the second temple in certain ways was greater than the first temple. Similarly, the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash is intended to enable us to reach an even higher level, which is the third Beit HaMikdash, which will be built in the near future by Mashiach, and which will represent a higher spiritual plateau than both the first and the second Beit HaMikdash. This is reflected in the statement of our sages quoted above. The site will not be called a mountain as referred by Abraham, or a field as referred to by Yitzchak, but rather as a house as referred by Yaakov, something which is permanent. So what do we see here so far? He hasn't answered the question yet, but what he's saying here is that there is something positive to look forward to. This is the thought, to borrow cliche, that Judaism doesn't see us spiraling downward, but sees us spiraling upwards. We're constantly...
Adam wouldn't have sinned. This all wouldn't all transpire.
Right. But if Adam wouldn't have sinned, this wouldn't have transpired. But that's why in Tehillim, in Perek Samach Vav, in 66, there's a pasuk that says, Noira alila al bnei Adam. What is the Noira alila al bnei Adam? Fearful is the manipulative ideas from God on people. And Chassidus explains that that was the referring to Adam Arishon and his children, and mainly Adam, the Adam, that it was indirectly caused by God that he should sin, because that was the intent, that he should be able to go out of the Gan Eden into the world and go through the whole challenge. So in a way, Chassidus takes away the harshness of the blame from Adam and says this was all orchestrated by God. So when you see somebody, I know when we were in yeshiva and you saw somebody that either went through a very terrible challenge or failed somewhere, so the Bachrim would always say, Noira alil al bnei Adam. It was that concept which is explained in Chassidus. The Rebbe has a whole sikh on it, by the way, where he explains this concept at great level, at great depth. But nevertheless, you're right. But it's not a question, because it seems that was the plan of God initially, that they should fail in order that they should be able to reach a higher level. This is also reflected in the continuation of the verse. So here the Rebbe already begins to give the answer, although he doesn't explain it, but he gives the answer to the question. The question is, how could you reconcile this with the sadness and with the actual descent, and why is it read on Tisha B'Av? So the Rebbe says this is also reflected in the continuation of the verse. How does the city sit solitary, in which Jerusalem is described as being like a widow? The emphasis here is not a widow, but like a widow. Our sages explain that the wording is precise, like a widow, but not actually widowed, heaven forbid. For the connection to God, the husband, though not a parent, continues to exist. For the intent of the descent of the city's destruction is for the ascent, which will come afterwards. Therefore, it's not considered a genuine descent, and Jerusalem is considered merely like a widow. Which means to say that even though the Tzemach Tzedek is talking about the future, but the Tzemach Tzedek sees in the descent now already the ascent that will happen later. In other words, he sees in the sorrow, he already sees the happiness that will happen later. You know, if you imagine a scene where you have a newlywed of a couple that's truly in love, and it's a story that happened in Vietnam, and the husband was sent away, and the wife volunteered to be a nurse, and she was also sent to a military hospital, but not in Vietnam, so she would see her husband from time to time. And then one time in the place where the husband was, there were terrible explosions, and they said there were no survivors. And she was in mourning, because the obvious was there that she would never see him again. And, you know, she tried to find comfort in the work, and she refused to leave because she knew that her husband would have wanted her to continue. And this went on for a good few months, and she was very bitter. And then one day, all of a sudden, as she's standing there in the OR helping the doctors with some surgery, in walks a person, and she looks at him. He has a bandage on his head, but otherwise he's healthy, and it's none other than her husband. So at first there's the shock, but then there is the unbelievable excitement and relief that he's okay, and that everything is fine. So if you were to make a storyline out of it, either in written form or in film form, and you read the line where she's terribly upset, but if you already read the end, so in the sadness you actually see the ultimate, that as sad as it is, you already see that in the future it's going to be unbelievably bright. So therefore, even though you feel bad for her at the time that she's going through the horror, but you know that ultimately she will have such delight that it will wipe away all of the sadness. And the more sorrow that she has now, the greater the happiness will be later. That Tzemach Tzedek had the ability to see within the exile, even though he couldn't stand the suffering of the Jews, and he fought all the time to bring relief to the Jewish people. And speaking about the women that lost husbands, he was very involved in trying to track down the husbands and to reconnect them. That was one of the famous things that was famous for, and wrote a lot of response on it. But nevertheless, he was able to see the inner side of it. So now we understand that when he says on the Pasuk Eicha Yashva, that it's talking about in the positive, is because he sees the future of what will be when Mashiach comes. But one thing we learn here is that the Jewish people can never be part of everybody else. Either they are on the top, like oil can't mix with water, or if God forbid they fall to the bottom. They're never in the middle. And as much as Jews think that they will emulate others and be like them, at the end it doesn't happen. It cannot happen. They either float all the way to the top and rise to the top and do what they have to do, or God forbid the opposite, which we don't want to mention. We have another few minutes, so I want to go a little deeper into it. To clarify the above, a lot of times what the Rebbe does in a Maimer is that he states his position right in the beginning, and then he starts to explain it and go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you reveal unbelievable treasures in the words of the way the Rebbe sees it, and he brings it out in such a clear way that it is what we call Nifloyos HaTorah, the wonders of Torah. So to clarify the above, as explained by the Rebbe Rashab was with the fifth Chabad Rebbe, who he says that the ultimate intent of the creation is God's desire for a dwelling place in the lower worlds. So there's a very famous discourse from the Rebbe Rashab that was written in 1906, Tofrei Samach Vav, and in fact, many people felt that that was a year that Mashiach should come, but Mashiach didn't come, but instead there was a huge revelation of Pnimius HaTorah, and that was in that Hemshech sequence of Maimarim, which is 160 Maimarim of Tafrei Samach Vav. And over there he states in the beginning of the Maimer that that the ultimate intent of creation is for the Dira B'Tachtonim. And it's based on Tanya, where Tanya says that all of the great revelations that are described above in the higher worlds is all for the purpose of the descent in our world. That our world is where the desire of Hashem is. That Hashem wants the dwelling place here. So this intent is brought to fruition through the divine service of the souls of the Jewish people, as alluded to in our sage's statement, with whom did he consult with regard to the entire creation? With the souls of the righteous. This is a very famous medrash, that the medrash says that before God created the world, so he says, "B'min nimlach b'nishmasem shel tzadikim." He consulted with the neshamas of the righteous to see whether it's worth or not. So, what does this allude to? The question that the Frierdiker Rebbe asks in a Maimer, in Tafshin Gimel, the Frierdiker Rebbe asks a question, and he says, if you say that before creation, with whom did he consult? The souls themselves are created beings. So if the souls themselves are created beings, what does it mean that he consulted with them? They weren't even in existence to consult with them. So he says that it doesn't mean that he consulted with them, but Hashem, God, visualized the delight that he will have from the avodah, from the service of the souls of the righteous, and that convinced him that he should create the world. Which means to say that when it says that God created the world and his desire was that he should dwell in the lower worlds, who is going to fulfill the mission? To fulfill the mission are the souls of the Jewish people, and that they were supposed to do it. But now the Rebbe says, for the world was created in a perfect state. For the essence of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, was in the lower worlds. So before I go there, I just want to explain what this means. So there's a famous dispute in the Medrash about when was the first revelation of the divine in the world. And many of the Chachamim say that the first great revelation of God took place at the time of the giving of the Torah, and then it became more manifest in the world with the construction of the Mishkan. But before that, the world was a void and never had the revelation of the world. Comes along Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is known because he wrote the Zohar, and he is one of the founding fathers of Kabbalah and Pnimius HaTorah, and he says, I disagree with you. And he says, Olam al miluyah nivra, that the world was created in its fullest, fittest sense. And not only that, not only does he say that the Shekhinah, that the divine presence was here, but the Ikar Shekhinah. What is the Ikar Shekhinah? The Ikar Shekhinah means the main part of the Shekhinah. The main part of the Shekhinah, speaking about the infinite light of God, was already in the world. Mm-hmm. And if you say that from the beginning the infinite light of God was already in the world, it was not. It was only because of the sins of Adam and the subsequent 6 generations that caused for that light to leave. So it means that the world, when it was created, was in a perfect state. What is the difference of saying if this was in a perfect state or not? Because according to the Chachamim, the Torah had to introduce something brand new in the world. And it went against the nature of the world. And that's why there will always be conflict between the world and the Torah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says no, because since at the time of creation, the world was created through the Torah, and the Torah is the blueprints of the world. It means to say that right at the beginning, the essence of the divine was already revealed. So the fact that there is a void is only because it disappeared. But the fact that it was there before means that it is, in its natural state, a receptacle for the divine. And not only for the divine, which is the limited, finite revelation of God, which is called Shechina, but the Iker Shechina. As the Rebbe continues, for the term essence of the Shechina, which is the Iker of the Shechina, refers to the light of Sovev Kol Almin. Sovev Kol Almin is the infinite light that encompasses the world. For the term Shechina itself refers to the light which is Memala Kol Almin. Memala Kol Almin means the light which is limited and that it is measured according to the capabilities of the world. And that's why God's immanent light, which encloses itself within the creation. But the Sovev Kol Almin, which is the Iker Shechina, is way above that. It's unlimited. It's not bound by the world. Thus, the term the essence of the Shechina refers to the light which is Sovev Kol Almin, and indeed, this light transcends the world entirely, as explained in the series of Maimorim entitled Basi Ligani 5710. That's the Maimorim that the previous Rebbe wrote before he passed away. And interesting that this concept of Iker Shechina B'Tachtonim is developed fully in the first Maimer that the Rebbe recited when he accepted the leadership. And he goes from level to level to say that some say the Iker Shechina is Malchus Datzilus. Then he says, no, it's higher than that, Malchus Dein Sof, until he says it's Malchus even before the Tzimtzum. We don't have the time now to explain that, but the Rebbe alludes to it here that that's what the Iker the Shechina. So he says, let's just finish the next paragraph. Although the light which is Sovev Kol Almin, in other words, the infinite light of Hashem, was drawn down through the divine service of Adam, and subsequently the souls of the Jewish people, as explained above, it is correct to say that at the very beginning, the world was created in a perfect state. The intent is not that at creation the essence of Shechina has actually been drawn down into the world, for that can only be accomplished through divine service, but rather the intent is that the world was appropriate and fit to receive the light of the essence of Shechina. But, as explained above, to actually draw down that light, divine service is necessary. And that explains the implication of the verse, that God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden to till it and guard it, that through Adam's divine service, additional light will be drawn into the Garden of Eden, that it receives by nature, it only receives Memala Kol Almin. But through his work, it was able to receive the infinite light. Okay, so what have we learned so far? What we learned so far is that the world was considered to be a perfect state, and yet through the sin, the light of God disappeared. And through our avoda, we reveal the greater level of the infinite light. And what the Rebbe is going to say later is actually that the avoda of the Jews in a solitary way that was segregated from the pursuits of the world, and we remain devoted to Hashem, actually brings down an even greater infinite light that was there at the time of creation. And that is what causes the third Beis HaMikdash to descend and causes the third Beis HaMikdash to be permanent. In Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll have an opportunity to study a sequence to this mimer. We will let you know when. And but may it be that these days should be transformed into days of happiness and joy, and that their true essence will be revealed with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. Thanks for joining us.